The air war in South Vietnam was unlike any other. It saw the full might of the world's greatest military and economic power, America, pitted against an elusive but highly motivated enemy. The Viet Cong guerrilla was indistinguishable most of the time from the civilian population, and he had the priceless strategic advantage of fighting on his own ground. There were many different aspects to the air war in South Vietnam. The aircraft involved ranged from World War II piston-engine bombers to Mach 2 supersonic jet fighters. Among their most important missions were the support of troops in contact with the enemy, the destruction of key Viet Cong strongholds, the defense of American and South Vietnamese bases, and the interdiction of the communist supply effort, both by land and by water. In conventional war, missions can be flown by the book. Fighting the Americans in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong became masters of unconventional warfare. They were highly experienced, developed good tactics, and made skillful use of terrain. They relied on the North for frequent resupply of men, food, arms, and equipment. The Americans had to evolve a whole new way of fighting to deal with this. "15 years before the American involvement in Vietnam, France had been embroiled in a conflict in Southeast Asia as she tried to halt the independence movements in her former colonies. France's air power was composed largely of piston-engine combat aircraft dating from World War II. US involvement in the air war in South Vietnam began really in rather a small way. Elderly, propeller-driven trainers and bombers flown by the Farm Gate Detachment had been sent to Southeast Asia in October 1961 to advise the South Vietnamese Air Force. The fledgling Air Force of South Vietnam was equipped and trained by the Americans, flying armed trainers like the T-28 Trojan or obsolete combat machines like the A-1 Sky Raider and the B-26 Invader. The Farm Gate Detachment was designated as the US Air Force 1st Air Commando Group. Its airmen became the first Americans to see combat in Vietnam. The fighting was seen initially as a low-intensity conflict, and the Americans came up with a new term for it: counterinsurgency, coin warfare. The T-28 was the standard US Air Force advanced trainer of the 1950s. It became one of the first aircraft adapted for the war against the Viet Cong. It was used extensively in action, carrying nearly 2 tons of bombs, rockets, and gun pods under 6 wing hardpoints. Another combat aircraft deployed during the early years was the rugged and heavily armed Invader bomber. Veteran of World War II and Korea, it had been one of the most effective aircraft used by the Armée de l'Air in the early 1950s. The US Air Commandos also appreciated its qualities, operating 20 aircraft from 3 bases until 1964, when they were grounded due to wing fatigue. The Invader was later reintroduced into Vietnam in 1966. Operating from Nam Pnom in Thailand, it flew night interdiction missions against the North Vietnamese supply route. Typical of the close support missions flown at the time was an action in late November 1963. The Viet Cong ambush against 2 outposts in Anh Nguyen province was repulsed after American and South Vietnamese aircraft attacked again and again at low level within a short distance of friendly troops. By 1964, the US presence in Vietnam had escalated dramatically, and this was reflected in the equipment the Air Force was deploying to the theater. Covert advisory detachments like Farmgate were replaced by a full range of modern high-performance aircraft to fight the widening war against the Viet Cong. The first jet aircraft to be based in South Vietnam was the Martin B-57, a license-built version of the British Canberra tactical bomber. Initially, it was deployed for Patricia Lynn reconnaissance missions, but in February 1965, it flew the first Air Force combat strikes against VC positions east of Saigon. Australian Canberras also saw action in South Vietnam. As well as being used extensively for air support in the south, the B-57 also became an important aircraft in the night interdiction campaign against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. More fast movers were quickly deployed by the US Air Force to fight the in-country war in South Vietnam. By the end of 1965, 11 squadrons were operational from 4 bases. One of these was a unit conducting a combat evaluation, codenamed Soshi Tiger, of the F-5 Freedom Fighter. Designed as an inexpensive lightweight fighter, the small F-5 proved effective, though it lacked in range and warload for the US Air Force. The F-5 was nevertheless selected for the Vietnamese Air Force as its first jet fighter and entered service in June 1967. Primarily used as a fighter bomber, more than 140 were delivered to the South Vietnamese. By far the most important Air Force attack jet in the South Vietnam War was the Super Sabre. While the F-105 Thunder Chief stole the glamour with its strike missions up north, the F-100 became the mainstay of the dirty, mud-moving war against the Viet Cong. Nicknamed the Hun, the F-100 was America's first operational supersonic fighter. It was designed as an interceptor in the early 1950s, but by the time of its combat debut in Southeast Asia, it had evolved into a ground attack machine. The F-100 was introduced into combat not in Vietnam, but in the largely secret war in Laos. It was also initially committed to the strategic air campaign against North Vietnam, but proved unsuitable for this role. Instead, it found its niche as an attack jet providing close support of US troops in the south, where the air defense threat was much lower. The first units to be based in South Vietnam arrived in 1964. The Hun's presence quickly grew. At peak deployment in 1968, over 200 were committed to battle in 4 wings, with regular Air Force squadrons augmented by Air National Guard units. The F-100s were finally withdrawn from South Vietnam in July 1971 after 8 years of action. It had flown by far the largest number of missions of any American aircraft in Southeast Asia. In 1969, for example, Huns flew about 53,000 combat sorties compared to just under 20,000 by the Phantom. The importance of the Hun to the American war effort is underlined by the fact that its total of 360,000 combat missions was more than the combined total of all other US Air Force strike aircraft in Vietnam. But this performance came at a price. The US Air Force lost nearly 200 F-100s during combat. At the opposite end of the spectrum to the fast jets in terms of performance and glamour was the Sky Raider. One of the most versatile and valuable aircraft of the war in the South traced its origins from a US Navy carrier dive bomber design produced at the end of World War II. The Sky Raider was the most important combat aircraft in Vietnam in the early 1960s, being flown by the South Vietnamese and by the US Air Force Air Commandos. It was old. It was so slow that it was nicknamed SPAD after the World War I fighter. But the Sky Raider still had qualities which faster, more up-to-date aircraft couldn't match. Armed with 4 20mm cannon, it could also carry a heavy load of extremely varied weaponry on its 15 hardpoints.
Follow me.
And it was just as much at home flying from the deck of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier as it was taking off from a jungle strip at the height of the rainy season. One veteran pilot declared that with the Sky Raider he could put an ordnance within 50 feet of its aim point. He could stay airborne for 5 to 6 hours at a time, saturating the enemy with heavy fire, and operate when the weather wasn't good enough for jets to fly. One area where these qualities were especially required was during the rescue of a downed pilot, usually under heavy fire somewhere in North Vietnam. The veteran Sky Raider, known as Sandy from its radio call sign, operated closely with the Jolly Green rescue helicopters and coordinated the rescue. Guided by radio transmissions, the rescue helicopters closed in for the pickup. All the while, the Sandy would provide suppressive fire around the helicopter. The Sky Raiders were the last ones out of danger as they covered the withdrawal. And all the time, they were drawing fire from the enemy. Although the F-100 dominated the war in the South, the F-4 Phantom was also an important ground attack aircraft. Renowned as a MiG killer and strike aircraft in North Vietnam, the multi-role F-4 was also used extensively in the air-to-ground role. Although fast movers were seldom as accurate as slower prop-driven Sky Raiders, they could deliver a devastating warload when asked to support troops in contact, and their high speed made them less vulnerable to ground fire. The Phantom was operated by the US Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. During the bombing halt between 1968 and 1972, it was almost exclusively used as a ground attacker. By the middle of 1970, it had become the dominant tactical aircraft of the war, replacing the F-105 as the main strike aircraft up north and the F-100 in the south. Lack of a built-in gun was solved partially with cannon pods. These were effective at shooting down MiGs as well as for strafing the enemy. The extensive use of the Phantom is reflected in the fact that more were lost in Southeast Asia than any other type. F-4s accounted for 20% of the US Air Force's fixed-wing combat and operational losses in Vietnam. Another type which saw action in both North and South Vietnam was the Skyhawk. Navy air wings deploying to Southeast Asian waters would spend the first part of any cruise working up on Dixie Station, flying support missions over South Vietnam before moving north. Operating from bases at Chu Lai and Da Nang, Skyhawks also provided the Marine Corps with its own organic air support. Performance suffered in the hot, humid conditions of Vietnam, and rocket assistance was necessary to aid fully laden takeoffs from short runways. The A-4 combined high agility with an amazing weapons carrying ability for its small size. Contrasting the A-4 in terms of size and firepower was the B-52 Stratofortress bomber. One of the most controversial aspects of the war in Southeast Asia was the use of the giant B-52 as a counter-insurgency weapon against the Viet Cong. B-52s flew their first missions in 1965 under the codename Arclight. The US Air Force used two versions of the Buff, operating from bases in Thailand and on the island of Guam. The B-52F versions could deliver nearly 20 tons of bombs. Modified B-52Ds, which replaced them, could double that load, dropping an amazing 108 bombs at a time. These were dropped in saturation raids against suspected enemy camps and troop concentrations in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. As weapons of terror, the B-52s were feared more than any other by the Viet Cong. Flying too high to be seen or heard, the Buffs struck like an earthquake without warning. And when they hit targets, such as the North Vietnamese regular soldiers besieging the Marine combat base at Khe Sanh, they were devastatingly effective. The Vietnam War saw the development and combat use of many advanced new weapons, such as laser-guided bombs. These were used almost exclusively against strategic targets, such as bridges. Weapons of the war in South Vietnam were much less sophisticated. American ground attack jets dropped millions of unguided bombs, and technology was applied instead to refining these dumb weapons. Low-level delivery was made possible by the snake-eye set of retarding fins, which allowed the attacking aircraft to escape the blast of the weapons. Napalm, usually dropped in canisters, rather like fuel tanks, was used to attack widely dispersed targets. Rockets with a variety of explosive anti-armor and anti-personnel warheads were another hard-hitting alternative for area attacks. They had a devastating effect, packing a punch equivalent to a salvo from a battery of medium artillery. Rockets fired from aircraft were usually of higher caliber than those fired from helicopters. Guns were used for strafing. Most aircraft, with the notable exception of the early F-4 Phantoms, had 2 or even 4 built-in 20mm cannon. Attack aircraft in the south were known as mud movers for the simple reason that they fought down on the deck, dueling almost eye-to-eye with the Viet Cong insurgents on the ground. The air war against the Viet Cong was very much a short-range struggle. When supporting American or South Vietnamese troops in close combat with the Viet Cong, it called for very great accuracy in the delivery of weapons, often within meters of friendly troops. As a result, attacks were often pressed home at very low level. This could be very dangerous. Even though the communist insurgents lacked advanced weapons like guided missiles, they did have a lot of small arms, and low-level attacks brought the American fighters well within their range. Small arms and light anti-aircraft fire accounted for the vast majority of American aircraft losses over South Vietnam. Most of the supplies for the Viet Cong came down a maze of tracks through Laos, Cambodia, and into the border regions of South Vietnam, known collectively as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The US Air Force expended a great deal of effort in attempting to stem this supply. A successful weapon which was developed to fight this interdiction war was the gunship, a heavily armed version of a transport aircraft. The first of these was the AC-47, a gunship version of the venerable C-47 transport known as Spooky. Fitted with 3 rapid-firing machine guns in one side of the fuselage, these were also very effective close support weapons, being able to pour down a hail of withering fire on the Viet Cong. For a fast-moving jet, a fleeting target moving beneath the jungle canopy was hard to find, let alone attack. The answer lay in the Forward Air Controller, or FAC. Flying low and slow over the battlefield, so exposing himself to enemy gunfire, the FAC's dangerous task was to become thoroughly familiar with his assigned area of ground, so that he knew every hill and every valley. The slow movers in their fragile, prop-driven Cessnas played a vital part in snooping out, identifying and marking targets. Once a target was found, the FAC called up the fast movers' air support. Tactical aircraft could usually be armed and into the air within minutes of receiving a call from somebody needing air support. With bases the length of South Vietnam, American troops could rely on rapid air support. The Cessnas fired white phosphorus or smoke rockets to mark the targets for the jets. Nobody expected the FAC to hit the target with his rockets, but he could use the smoke to give accurate positional instructions to fighter pilots. The FAC's task was one of the most dangerous of the war, and many were shot down. But they were often instrumental in saving friendly troops.
Okay. You still have my smoke? I got your smoke still, right. Madam 2 and set them up hot in pairs. 2, Roger.
That looks pretty good. I'd like you to keep your pass as steep as possible and be especially vigilant for helicopters. Okay, real fine. That really knocked out a few trees. Okay, 6-1, I'd like you to put your bomb just short of 2s. You have the smoke coming out of the jungle with 2 foot in there. Roger, I got it. Now roll it in.
In a war without front lines, fire bases became the key to control of disputed territory. Strong points equipped with artillery served as bases from which patrols moved out into the country, but they were also tempting targets for attack. One such base was the Marine Corps combat base at Khe Sanh, which was cut off, besieged and attacked by the Vietnamese at the beginning of the 1968 Tet Offensive. Khe Sanh was dug out of the jungle and surrounded by high ground held by the Vietnamese. They quickly tightened the noose around the base. At Khe Sanh, it seemed that the Vietnamese wanted to inflict on the Americans the same kind of dramatic defeat suffered by the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Attacking the Americans were regular North Vietnamese army troops, equivalent to 4 divisions. They were armed with heavy artillery and tanks. The siege was to last 4 months, and only US aircraft could help the base. A well-conceived and directed inter-service cooperation was mounted to provide close air support for the tiny beleaguered garrison. 600 airstrikes were flown on the 21st of January at the height of the Vietnamese offensive. Braving intense anti-aircraft fire and bad weather, a massive effort was also set up to keep the base resupplied and fly out wounded soldiers. But even on the ground, there was no respite as Khe Sanh was under constant bombardment. As the supplies from the air bridge continued, Voodoos and other US Air Force reconnaissance aircraft gathered intelligence to pinpoint the enemy positions for further tactical strikes by Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps attack aircraft. The Vietnamese bombardment was intense. In one day alone, 1,300 artillery rounds slammed into the base. The airstrip, a prime target, came under constant attack by Vietnamese artillery and mortars, and the transports braved exploding shells during takeoff. This Hercules didn't make it. When it got too dangerous, the transports dropped their supplies by parachute. Over 600 drops were made by providers and Hercules. U.S. airstrikes continued. The most fearsome weapon used was the B-52. An American soldier describes an attack.
Arc light raids, B-52 raids. Really tremendous raids. You didn't even see the airplanes. All you saw was the air being ripped apart and ground thundering underneath you, and you're bouncing in the air. You're not even aware of where the planes could even have been.
The North Vietnamese had dug an elaborate network of bunkers, trenches and tunnels around Khe Sanh. Strikes by the Buff by day and by night obliterated them. B-52s flew 2,700 strikes in support of the siege of Khe Sanh. Tactical aircraft flew 24,000 strikes. By April 1968, the US Army 1st Cavalry Division had succeeded in breaking through the North Vietnamese Army forces to relieve the Marines at Khe Sanh. Pinned to the notice board of the US command post at Khe Sanh was the following inscription: "For those who fight for it, life has a flavor the sheltered never knew." Air power had been decisive in preventing a major defeat for the Americans, but elsewhere in Vietnam the story was largely different. By 1970, the Americans had begun to withdraw from the mire that had become Vietnam and hand over tactical air power to the South Vietnamese themselves. From the earliest farm gate deployment in 1961 to massive escalation of 500,000 troops in South Vietnam to the withdrawal of the last American airmen in 1972, tactical air power in South Vietnam played a key role in the war effort. But by the very nature of guerrilla warfare, large-scale use of air power in set-piece battles in Vietnam, such as Khe Sanh, were infrequent. Instead, air power's greatest achievements in South Vietnam were on a local scale, namely the effective support of friendly troops under fire by the enemy.